Constitution affects each of us in the most important and most intimate aspects of our lives. Whether we have access to contraceptives, whether a woman has an access to abortion, whether or not a person can refuse medical care, all of those are constitutional issues. When we think of some of the most important political questions right now, again we see how the Constitution affects us, the most intimate and important aspects of our lives. Whether gay and lesbian couples have a right to marriage equality, whether a state can adopt a law that has state and local police aggressively enforcing laws against immigrants, whether or not the federal health care law is constitutional. All of these are constitutional issues. Isn't it amazing that in 2012, we're governed by a document written in 1787? Isn't it amazing in 2012 that we're debating our most important social and political issues in terms of a document written well over 200 years ago? Now, in part, I think this is a reflection of the majesty of the Constitution, the genius of the document, that it could have been written so long ago and yet be relevant to our day-to-day lives. But in part, this is because it is a living Constitution. To be consistent with the theme of today, it is a Constitution that is truly under construction indefinitely. This isn't a new notion. Back in 1819, then Chief Justice John Marshall said, "We must never forget that it's a Constitution we are expounding, a Constitution meant to be adapted and endure for ages to come." And yet today, including on the United States Supreme Court, there are those who say it's not a living Constitution. They try to tell us that the Constitution means only what it did at the time that it was adopted. What I want to suggest to you today is that that's wrong. It has to be wrong. And that those like Justices Antonin and Scalia and Clarence Thomas who say this are terribly misguided. So why must it be a living Constitution? Well, to start with the most obvious, we live in such a different world today than the agrarian slave society of 1787. We can't be guided by the conceptions of those from so long ago. Think of constitutional issues that come up all the time now. If the police put a GPS device on somebody's car, is that a search? If there's electronic eavesdropping through the newest technology, is that a search? Can we really answer such questions by what the Fourth Amendment was thought to mean when it was adopted in 1791? Easy examples show us why we can't be governed by the thoughts of an earlier generation. Did you know that the same Congress that voted to ratify the 14th Amendment also voted to segregate the District of Columbia public schools? And the District of Columbia public schools were segregated from 1860s all the way until May 17th, 1954, when Brown versus Board of Education was decided. Should the Supreme Court really have said that segregation is okay because that's what the framers of the 14th Amendment thought? Or take an even simpler example. The Constitution refers to the President and Vice President using the pronouns he. If we were to follow the Scalia, the Thomas approach, then it would be unconstitutional to elect a woman as president or vice president until the Constitution is amended. Surely that can't be right. But there's other reasons, too, why it has to be a Constitution that's under construction indefinitely. We can never really know what those back in 1787 thought. It's a myth to even imagine that there was one intent behind constitutional provisions. About a decade ago, I had a wonderful professional experience of serving for 2 years on a commission to rewrite the Los Angeles City Charter. In California, a charter is much like a constitution. It creates the institutions of government. It allocates power among the branches. It can even provide additional rights beyond those in the Constitution. And we met several times a week from July 1997 through March of 1999. And then when we were done, we produced a document, like a constitution. They went to the voters who approved it in June 1999. Almost immediately after its adoption, questions arose as to what we meant. Almost always, it turned out, they were just questions we didn't think about. Or we just had different views about the words on the page and what they're meant to convey. Well, if that's true of a document written a decade ago, it's even more so with regard to a document written in 1867. When I teach constitutional law, I like to point to instances where James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, we think of as the preeminent founders, had totally different views. But there's other reasons, too, why it must be a living constitution. There's so many things that the Constitution just doesn't discuss. For example, the Constitution says that the President can appoint members of the Cabinet, but it doesn't say anything about how they're to be removed. You can't answer that except through interpretation, a living Constitution. The Constitution doesn't say anything about how the President, or whether the President, can recognize foreign governments. We have to interpret. We have to find an answer through a living Constitution. We think of the right to privacy. Nowhere in the document itself does it mention privacy. But surely that has to be interpreted to be a key aspect of the liberty that we all possess under the Constitution. And for almost a century, the Supreme Court has said that there is a right to privacy under the Constitution. It includes things like a right to marry, a right to procreate, a right to custody of one's children, a right to keep the family together, a right to control the upbringing of one's children, a right to purchase and use contraceptives, a right to abortion, a right to refuse medical care, a right to engage in private adult same-sex sexual activity. Now, justices like Scalia and Thomas would say none of those rights should exist. But would we want to be governed under a constitution where there's no protection of privacy? Doesn't privacy itself show us why it has to be a living constitution? I find it, maybe ironic is the best word, that the very conservative justices who want to tell us it isn't a living constitution ignore this when it suits their purposes. Again, let me give you a couple of examples. Just 2 years ago, the United States Supreme Court, in the Citizens United decision, said that corporations have the right to spend unlimited amounts of money in elections to get the candidates they prefer elected and the candidates they oppose defeated. I challenge anyone, Antonin Scalia, Ernst Thomas, or anyone else, to show any indication that the framers of the First Amendment meant to protect a right of corporations to spend unlimited amounts of money in election campaigns. Where is their concern about framers' intent in this area? Or another important example, one that touches so many of us. Can colleges and universities consider race as a factor in admissions decisions to enhance diversity, to benefit minorities? More generally, is affirmative action permissible? If we really wanted to follow the framers' intent here, there's no doubt that they meant to allow things like affirmative action. The Congress that ratified the 14th Amendment also adopted a whole host of programs that could only be thought of as affirmative action programs. However, when it comes to interpreting the Constitution, justices like Scalia and Thomas don't want to pay any attention to that. Here they want a living Constitution that's consistent with their conservative ideology. The reality is, the only way that we can be governed under a document written in 1787 is for it to be a document that's under construction indefinitely. Part of the greatness of our Constitution, part of how it ensures liberty and justice for all, is that it is a living Constitution. The late Justice Louis Brandeis said that the greatest threat to liberty will come from people who claim to act for beneficial purposes. He said, people born to freedom know to resist the tyranny of despots. He said, the insidious threat to liberty will come from well-meaning people of zeal with little understanding of what the Constitution is about. I would suggest, no matter how exalted they are, those who tell us it's not a living Constitution have little understanding of what the Constitution is about.